Good morning. This is Omar Muhammad, and this is our 36 minutes on antisemitism. Today's episode is focused on anonymity and accountability online, and our guest speaker is Dave Rich from the Community Security Trust. Welcome, Dave. We would be happy to know more about you. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you for having me on. I am Director of Policy at the Community Security Trust, which is a UK-based organization. It's a not-for-profit. And we organize security across the whole of the Jewish community in the UK, primarily to try and prevent a terrorist attack or deal with hate crime targeting Jewish buildings and people and organizations. We provide support for victims of antisemitism, and we work very closely with the police and with government in this. And more broadly, we research trends in antisemitism, its connection with extremist ideologies, how it plays out both online and offline.
Thank you, Dave. We are glad to have you today. Before I go into the discussion, because the anonymity online is a big concern. It's a big problem. But let's first understand from your perspective a question that I always ask, which is, what is the definition of anti-Semitism?
Anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish hatred is bigotry, hatred, discrimination, harassment directed at Jewish people. It's a word that was invented in the 1870s, not by Jews, but by an anti-Semite called Wilhelm Marr in Germany, who wanted a scientific, respectable sounding name for his anti-Jewish policies. And he came up with the term anti-Semitism. It's a completely invented word, but it was always meant to be about hostility and prejudice and discrimination towards Jews specifically. The underlying idea behind anti-Semitism in sort of lay terms is the idea that Jews are always up to no good. They're always up to something. You can't trust them. They're always pulling the strings behind whatever's going on in the world. They've got an ulterior motive and a hidden agenda. And that kind of vaguely conspiratorial suspicion is what underlies a great deal of anti-Semitic thinking, ideas, narratives, and so on.
Dave, I have asked someone who is also going to be on our podcast from UNESCO. I asked him about the definition of anti-Semitism, and they do not have. This is the reason why I always ask about the definition, because without a working definition, it will be difficult to tackle anti-Semitism. Why do you think it's difficult? Some major organizations do not have a working definition.
So there are a few different options for a kind of formal working definition. The oldest and most widely used is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, which is very widely adopted by governments and institutions around the world. That in itself is based on a working definition of anti-Semitism that was drawn up by a European Union agency in the early 2000s. And it was for precisely this reason. It was to aid law enforcement and other kind of hate crime monitoring agencies in identifying hate crimes or hate incidents that are anti-Semitic and distinguishing between them and things that are not anti-Semitic. And it was always meant to be a very practical guide. Now, this proved to be controversial with some people because this original working definition that the European Union Monitoring Centre developed in the early 2000s and that then became the IHRA definition, it includes within it a recognition that some modern anti-Semitism is expressed in the context of or through the language of kind of hostility towards Israel. Not that the two things are the same, they're not, they're different. And it says very clearly criticism of Israel cannot be considered to be anti-Semitic. But it recognizes that anti-Semitism has changed over the years. It doesn't only come from the far right anymore. And as we've seen since the 7th of October, we do get these surges in anti-Jewish hatred and harassment of Jewish people that are connected to broader kind of anger and sentiments over Israel. Now, this is controversial for some people who don't like to acknowledge that reality, or who feel that it restricts too much their ability to criticize and critique Israel and Israel's policies and actions. I don't think it does limit that, but that's where the controversy comes in. So there are two other more recent alternative definitions that have been drafted. One is the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism. The other is called the Nexus definition or declaration. But the IHRA working definition is the most widely used. And broadly speaking, for agencies that are tasked with tackling anti-Semitism, with identifying examples of anti-Semitism, either within their own organization or in wider society, you need some kind of definition to assess things against. You need something to kind of guide your investigation. Every example will be different. And one of the things people struggle with is that the same kind of language can be anti-Semitic in one context, but not in another, depending on who's saying it, why they're saying it, what their intention is, what the impact is, who's listening to it, and all the broader contextual issues. And you need to assess every different example or incident on its individual merits. And the IHRA working definition can be a useful kind of non-binding practical guide to doing that.
The reason I asked Dave, because of the recent surge of anti-Semitism online, especially in the post horrific attacks on southern Israel by Hamas on October 7th. But let me ask, what is the current state of anti-Semitism online?
Look, the internet is absolutely central to the way that anti-Semitism works today, in the same way that it is absolutely central to the way anything in the world works. I mean, it's integral to how we're recording this podcast right now, to everything we do in our lives, and there's no reason why anti-Semitism should be any different. But it's not just a neutral platform. I think we're going to probably get into this, but social media companies in particular, the way the algorithms operate, the way certain narratives are amplified and spread, do actually play an important, influential role in the prominence and the availability of anti-Semitic ideas. And this operates in two ways. Firstly, it allows extremists, anti-Semites to connect with each other around the world, to encourage each other to share content, to share ideas. It creates a virtual community where previously these people may have been isolated. And secondly, it allows people who want to target Jews with anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish harassment to do so directly, to identify and target individual Jews or Jewish organizations online, whereas previously they would not have been able to get to them directly. So those are the two kind of main roles that the online world plays in facilitating anti-Semitism, the way it operates.
Now, there are thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of anonymous accounts on different platforms who spread anti-Semitism. Now, I know it's very difficult when we talk about anonymous accounts. Myself, I worked anonymously for years, and I was in need of being anonymous for my protection. But it's difficult when you think about it and ask for legislations to reduce the possibility of anonymous accounts. I mean, is there any way governments can work through legislations to reduce and also ask for verification of accounts?
So this this is part of a much broader policy discussion, I think, about government regulation of online platforms in general. At the moment, the internet is pretty much an unregulated space. You do have some laws in some countries. Germany has brought in laws. Britain has brought in the Online Safety Act, but is not yet implementing it. But broadly speaking, it remains an unregulated space. And for an industry that is so influential and a technology that is so powerful, I think that people are starting to recognize that there are too many harms associated with that lack of regulation for it to be sustained much longer. And we do need something. Now, obviously, the moment you talk about government regulating the online space, you're talking about government regulating speech, which is different from regulating car safety or, other kind of industries. But still, I think there have to be ways that do it, but that still respect democratic rights and democratic freedoms. And anonymity is a really important issue here. Now, if we look at how platforms operate already, some platforms allow anonymity and others don't. I mean, according to the terms and conditions of Facebook, you're supposed to use your own name. Now, of course, lots of people probably don't. How good Facebook or Meta are at enforcing that is, another question. And quite often with platforms, what we see is that the rules of behavior look pretty good on paper, but aren't actually enforced properly. When it comes to anti-Semitism and anonymity, one thing I would say is that a lot of anti-Semitism comes from people who are acting in their own name. And that's one of the surprising things in a way, and perhaps shocking, but it is a reality, is that people are very happy to spread anti-Semitic ideas in their own name. Some of them don't realize what they're saying is anti-Semitic, but a lot do. Especially on Twitter, you get a lot of anti-Semitic actors, a lot of extremist actors who use their own name. They've got verification and they use it as a very powerful platform for spreading anti-Semitic ideas. So removing anonymity wouldn't deal with the problem, as a whole. It would still leave a big problem. I think, but people do use anonymity to hide behind, especially if they're using social media as a tool to target and harass and threaten individuals, whether that's Jewish individuals with anti-Semitism or other kind of examples. And I think the fact that platforms not just allow this, but actually enable a form of harassing behavior, threatening behavior that just simply couldn't happen without their technology, I don't think that's acceptable. I think it's just fundamentally wrong that platforms have created a technology that enables this kind of harmful behavior and don't have any responsibility for it. Now, to set against that is the fact that, as you said from your personal experience, there are many settings in which anonymity is really very valuable and quite essential. Your experience is in the value of anonymity in an undemocratic or repressive society, but even within democracies, there are lots of people. If we look at, for example, domestic abuse victims of sexual violence who want to talk about their experiences, anonymity is important in those settings. And I think one way to deal with this conundrum, but on the one hand, there are times when anonymity is valuable, on the other hand, there are times where it's harmful, is that platforms should be free, as they are now, to allow anonymity or to ban it. And currently, as we say, different platforms take a different approach. But if a platform allows anonymity, and if someone takes advantage of that anonymity to commit criminal or harmful behaviors, then the platform should bear some of the legal responsibility for that. And then they can make that choice. They can allow this very powerful tool of anonymity, but with that comes responsibility, and with responsibility should come liability. And I think that's one way to kind of balance these different competing needs.
In that case, it's the platforms itself, the Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and many other platforms. I mean, should they be held accountable?
Yeah, it's the platforms, but they have to be held accountable by regulation. Because, look, we've been talking to social media platforms for nearly 20 years now to try to get them to tackle hate and extremism on their platforms. And we've come a long way from the times when they had literally zero moderation and just weren't interested to where we are now. But what we've learned over the years is that they only really shift in a significant way if they are forced to do so, either by the threat of criminal sanctions or meaningful financial penalties, and those financial penalties need to be enormous to be meaningful, or personal liability on the part of the directors, or such reputational damage that advertisers pull out. I mean, which is what Twitter or X has been experiencing over the last year or so. But it needs that kind of the stick more than the carrot in a way, because broadly speaking, social media companies are so wedded to the business model of maximizing engagement, maximizing time online as a way of generating revenue, that any fundamental shift that undermines that just doesn't really work for them unless they're forced to do it. And so I think given the experience we've had of trying to get them to act out of their better nature, and given the stakes, and given that we now, I think, are really starting to understand the power of this technology in shaping society, I think we do need regulation that has democratic oversight, and that sets the parameters of what is expected of companies that create and deploy this very powerful technology.
Dave, I sat for 1 hour watching Al Jazeera Mubashir, Al Jazeera Live, in Arabic and in English. They have the live streaming chat attached to the channel. For 1 hour, all I read, jihad against the Jews, supporting the October 7th attack, and from anonymous accounts, hundreds of messages every minute. I mean, who should be held accountable for this? I mean, YouTube should do something about it, but also it's no longer the question of anonymity is required for protection in certain cases, as you mentioned, but this time it's spreading anti-Semitism, murdering the Jews, supporting violence against the Jews, supporting the terrorism of Hamas. Who should deal with this?
I mean, this is part of the problem, is that this is a global issue. Countries, governments are kind of looking at it individually. There have been some efforts for intergovernmental sort of policies and positions, but they haven't really come to anything relevant or powerful enough to make a difference, I think. So you're talking about a global problem. You're talking about such a proliferation of platforms. I mean, we're just discussing some of the main, half a dozen of the better known platforms. But, the number of different platforms, and then you have, private servers within Discord and so on. It's enormous and it's proliferating all the time. And there is a whole enormous section of the kind of online world that doesn't even want to comply with kind of mainstream norms, that doesn't want to be seen as respectable, but actually platforms that promote themselves as being places where you literally can post anything with no comeback at all. The worst of all is 4chan, and 4chan is completely anonymous. And this is where terrorists literally post their content, wind each other up to carry out attacks, share tips, all the rest of it, along with every other example of the worst of human behavior. So, I think kind of morally, I think the responsibility lies with the platforms and the people whose business model is to profit from this kind of content. But I think in reality, it is going to be down to governments to try and bring in regulations that actually have teeth and that are enforceable and that come with sufficient resourcing of regulators or police to actually enforce any regulations that are brought in. This is part of the problem, is that the scale of the challenge is so monumental that all you're ever really going to be able to do is come up with test cases that enforce where the red lines are, and that then force the social media companies to bring in, to improve their own internal kind of mechanisms, their own internal AI to actually catch most of this content, ideally all of this content themselves, and put, because ultimately the knowledge of how to do it and the responsibility and the ability to do it at scale has to come from within the companies themselves.
Now, many of these companies have the power of algorithms. If you follow or scroll down a video on YouTube or a tweet on Twitter or X or a post on Facebook, you are really what you watch, because if you watch one or two anti-Semitic contents, it will keep bringing you more anti-Semitic contents on and on and on. How can the companies develop better algorithms that can actually reduce this type of contents?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's lots of research now that shows exactly what you're saying, that if you look at anti-Semitic content, you'll get more of it sent your way. There's also research showing that basically if you start a blank account and don't look at anything, you'll still get harmful content sent your way by the algorithms, depending on which platform you're on. So that is an absolutely central part of the problem. And it comes back to this idea that anything that increases engagement is favored within the companies, and anything that significantly decreases engagement is not prioritized. And this is where, when the internet started out and when social media first began, there was an argument that this was just a neutral space. It was like putting up a notice board that anyone could pin anything to, and the person who put the notice board up, just walks away and has no responsibility for it. And this is what sort of lay behind, this sort of thinking is what lay behind probably the most important piece of legislation that exists, which is, in America, the Section 230 of the Communications Act, I think it is, which was passed in the mid-90s, which basically gave platforms immunity from legal responsibility for what is posted on their platforms, because the idea was that it's the people posting it who are fully responsible. The shift some years after that to a form of social media in which the social media companies create algorithms to deliberately amplify certain types of content, to push them towards users ahead of other types of content, which are done for financial reasons, for advertising and so on. That completely changes the role of the platforms. It makes them, if not completely publishers, then certainly curators. It certainly gives them partial responsibility, I think, for what people are seeing. And like you say, the way the algorithm works, it takes people down a path of more and more incremental extremism. And that can apply to anything, whether it's anti-Semitism or anything else. It takes what it thinks you're interested in and then gives you not just more of the same, but each one just dialed up a bit of a notch, And, the social media companies, the main ones, the mainstream ones that want to be kind of respectable and respected, I think they recognize that this has been harmful, and they've taken some steps to try and work with law enforcement to try and address it. But they're very marginal steps, and the fundamental shift in mindset that needs to happen hasn't happened. And like I say, I don't think it'll happen unless it is forced on them.
What are organizations like yours are doing? What efforts are you making to help reduce not just the anonymous contents, but also the anti-Semitic contents online in general?
So we've had for a number of years what's known as trusted flagger status, or it has different names for different platforms, but it's a relationship that enables us to not just report anti-Semitic content to the mainstream platforms in the way that any member of the public could, but we also have the relationships with the policy teams where our reports can get prioritized. We can escalate things if we think mistakes are made. If we think there's a new trend online that they are missing, then we can feed that in. And to a certain extent, that has been helpful. And the main platforms have been receptive to that. And it means we can provide a service to our community where if people report anti-Semitic content to us that is affecting them, that they've been targeted by, we can try and get it removed. But really, this is dealing with the symptoms, not the cause. And, our role should not be to do the platform's job for them. I mean, we're a charity at the end of the day, funded by the Jewish community. And these are, the biggest, wealthiest companies on earth with the best engineers, software engineers on earth who should be able to figure out these problems for themselves. And for all that they've come a long way, they're still not, I think, prioritizing it properly. So, a couple of years ago, we started noticing that kind of ISIS branded content was appearing on Facebook. We were finding it in various different places, and this was very openly, with the flag and all the rest of it. There was no mistaking what it was. And, we have a small team of researchers here, and we were finding this stuff fairly easily. So there's no excuse for Facebook not to be aware of it and be removing it immediately. And some of this stuff had been up for months. And that just comes down to prioritization. If Meta decided that identifying and removing hate content was the single biggest priority for the company above anything else and committed commensurate resources to that, then I'm confident they would be able to work out how to get rid of everything and not just the whatever percentage it is that their automatic filters do currently remove.
Can artificial intelligence or the machine learning tools help provide a solution?
So this is exactly my point. Is to a certain extent they do. I mean, so Meta, for example, if we take them as kind of the biggest of all, their machine learning, their AI does remove most hate content, most extreme content from the platform, but that still leaves an enormous amount there just because of the scale of the problem. And the amount that it leaves on there is sufficient to actually do harm in terms of radicalizing people, in terms of encouraging people to offline harms, and so on. And whenever we raise this with different companies, the answer we get is, well, it's just really difficult to understand sentiment, to identify images, and so on and so on. But I think that's a matter of prioritization. It's a matter of will. And it comes out of this example I just mentioned. If CST, with our small team of researchers, can find ISIS branded content on Meta platforms, then there's no excuse for Meta's own filters not picking it up. And if they're not picking it up, it's because they're not prioritizing it enough to put in enough time and resource and effort to making them good enough to pick up everything.
All of this, how have this impacted the Jewish life and Jewish communities, whether in the UK or in the areas where you monitor anti-Semitic content?
It has a huge impact, and the impact comes in a few different ways. So one of them obviously is you're much more likely to see anti-Semitic content online than you are to hear an anti-Semitic comment from someone in your day-to-day life. Anti-Semitism has always been around, right? This is a prejudice that is as old as the hills. And we've always known it's there in society, and people have preconceptions and negative stereotypes and all the rest of it. But broadly speaking, in your day-to-day life, when you go to work or to school or to the shops or whatever, you don't hear those comments expressed to your face that often. So you can go about your normal life without it necessarily being touched by anti-Semitism. What the internet does, and particularly what social media has done, has just made it much harder to avoid the presence of anti-Semitism. You will encounter it much more, especially if you use social media to look at things you're interested in to do with Jewish life, to do with Israel, and so on. The other thing that social media does that really affects, I think, the self-confidence and the mindset of a lot of Jewish people is it magnifies everything that is happening. And the more that people use social media as our primary source of information and news about just what is going on in the world, the more we are within our bubbles. So an anti-Semitic attack happens in London or New York or Paris or wherever, and it gets videoed or photographed and it goes online and it goes around the world. We're all affected by it, and it makes Jewish people feel like you kind of, this is this is representative of reality every day for all of us, whereas in fact it's just one incident and it's one person. And at times like this, where there's a lot more anti-Semitism going around than normal, and you get more of these things, and every day there's something else, and social media amplifies it and brings it to your attention, it generates this because as humans we draw patterns between things and we focus on what we see and don't think about what we're not seeing. It generates this narrative and this fear that Jewish communities are under siege and anti-Semitism is endemic and all the rest of it. And of course, actually, if you look at opinion polling, which gives you a much broader picture of what people across society think, in Britain, most people are not at all anti-Semitic, quite the opposite. Most people say they have a favorable opinion of Jews. Anti-Semitism is a marginal thing. It's less marginal than it was, and that's worrying, but it's still marginal. But it's very hard to keep that broader context in mind when every day you're scrolling through Twitter or Instagram or TikTok for, younger Jews, and you're just seeing anti-Semitism on these platforms all the time.
Given that you mentioned it's marginal in the UK, has there been any community-led initiatives to combat anti-Semitism online?
So there are. I mean, look, like I say, we've engaged with platforms directly for many years, as have other organisations trying to tackle anti-Semitism. We've also done public campaigns. Every now and again, when a particularly egregious incident happens, you'll get an attempt to boycott certain platforms, to encourage advertisers to boycott certain platforms. That's happened in the past with Twitter. It's happened in the past with Facebook. It does get attention for a while. How much it shifts the dial permanently, I'm not so sure. So for the last few years, a lot of the focus has ended up being on pushing for regulation, and we have had a regulatory law, the Online Safety Act, which sort of wound its way through Parliament in recent years. It took a very long time. It went through various different versions, and all the way along that, there was a lot of kind of policy lobbying from different organizations to try and not just to do with anti-Semitism, but all forms of online harms, to try and get it fit for purpose. Of course, the problem is, a regulatory bill, from start to finish, it can be 5 years before it gets on the statute book, and then another couple of years before it's properly implemented and enforced. And by that time, the whole online landscape has completely fundamentally changed. So coming up with regulation that will be relevant and effective at the point where it comes into law, however many years down the road, is a real challenge.
In closing, Dave, what recommendation you might have for policymakers, but also the online platforms? I know we have went through many of them. If in terms of policy recommendations?
Look, there's two challenges when it comes to online hate and online anti-Semitism. One of them is the kind of day-to-day anti-Semitism that ordinary people see on the platforms that ordinary people use. That's different meta platforms, Twitter, YouTube, so on. And that's one thing, and that's where a lot of the focus is. And the other challenge is one that is in a physical sense is more dangerous, but fewer people see, which is the kind of real hardcore extremism and incitement that goes on alternative platforms, less compliant platforms, whether that's 4chan, whether that's Gab, whether that's Telegram. Some of these are really big. I mean, Telegram is huge, others smaller. But like I say, these are platforms that market themselves to extremists as being effectively unregulated spaces. And this is where, especially if we look at far-right terrorism, there is a global subculture of far-right terrorism that would not exist without these alternative social media platforms. And that has proven in recent years to be extremely effective in generating terrorist attacks all around the world, whether that's against mosques in Christchurch, against synagogues in Pittsburgh, and in Halle in Germany, whether it's attacking African Americans in Buffalo, etc., etc. Now, these two different types of problems generate different or need different policy approaches, but they connect, they do merge. I mean, since 7th of October, we've seen an absolute outpouring of Hamas generated terrorist content on Twitter, for example. So this division it's not a complete division, they do connect. And the answer to both of them ultimately is going to have to come from governments and from law enforcement, because the industry hasn't proven itself to being capable of coming up with solutions.
Dave, thank you so much. This was our 36 minutes on anti-Semitism.